The year is 1099. Picture this for a moment. You're standing on Jerusalem's ancient walls at dawn, watching the horizon darken, not with storm clouds, but with an army that outnumbers your defenders 15 to 1. Your water ran out 3 days ago. Children are drinking their own urine. The July heat is killing more Christians than Muslim arrows. Your commanders estimate you have 48 hours before disease finishes what siege engine started. Yet in 6 weeks, you'll be standing in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, knee-deep in the blood of 70,000 enemies, weeping as you touch the stone where Christ was laid. The impossible will have happened, not once, but repeatedly over 200 years. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will shatter everything you thought you knew about the Crusades. First, the tactical innovations these barbaric knights pioneered that modern armies still use today. Second, why Muslim commanders who'd conquered half the known world feared Templar charges more than death itself. Third, the psychological warfare techniques that turned religious faith into the medieval world's most devastating weapon. But here's what the history books don't tell you about Jerusalem's defenders. They weren't just soldiers. They were men who'd sold everything, marched 2,500 miles through hell, and sworn oaths that made retreat literally worse than death. When a Templar took his vows, he wasn't just joining an army. He was signing a contract written in his own blood that said, "I will hold this ground or die on it. There is no third option." For 200 years, that faith would be tested in ways that defy imagination. And sometimes, impossibly, miraculously, repeatedly, it would be enough. In 1096, 100,000 Europeans began walking toward a city 2,500 miles away that most had never seen. They had no maps, no central command, no supply lines. Military experts gave them a 5% survival rate. By the time they arrived 3 years later, only 12,000 remained. Those 12,000 would conquer an empire that had stood for 400 years. Think about that for a moment. 12,000 starving disease survivors defeating armies that outnumbered them 4 to 1. It shouldn't have been possible. Physics, logistics, mathematics, everything said it couldn't happen. Yet on July 15th, 1099, those impossible men would stand knee-deep in blood inside Jerusalem's holiest places, weeping as they touched stones where Christ had walked. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before the miracle came the nightmare. Before the conquest came the gauntlet of death that killed 88,000 believers before they ever saw a Muslim soldier. November 27th, 1095, the city of Clermont, France. Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of 10,000, nobles, knights, peasants, priests, and spoke words that would ignite the bloodiest religious movement in history. "Your brothers in the East are suffering," he said. "Muslims desecrate the Holy Sepulchre. They torture pilgrims. They enslave Christians. Will you let Christ's tomb remain in heathen hands?" The crowd's response shook the cathedral walls. "Deus vult." God wills it. That phrase would become a battle cry that echoed for 200 years. But here's what Urban didn't tell them. The journey was 2,500 miles through hostile territory. Summer heat that killed armoured men in hours. Winter cold that froze sentries standing upright. Disease that could wipe out half an army in weeks. Starvation. Thirst, enemies on all sides. The smart money said this crusade would die before crossing into Asia. The smart money was almost right. August 15th, 1096, 6 a.m. The first organised Crusader army departed Cologne, 100,000 strong. Knights in full armour riding destriers worth a year's wages. Peasants carrying farm tools they'd sharpened into weapons. Priests clutching crosses and promising that faith would sustain them when food ran out. They had provisions for 60 days. The journey would take 1,000. What happened next was predictable and horrible. The so-called People's Crusade, 40,000 peasants following a charismatic monk named Peter the Hermit, rushed ahead without waiting for the main army. They believed God would protect them. God did not. By October, Turkish cavalry had slaughtered them in the Anatolian foothills. 40,000 dead in a single afternoon. Peter the Hermit survived by hiding in a ditch. The lesson was brutal and clear. Faith alone wouldn't be enough. The main Crusader armies, 5 separate forces following different routes, fared better, but barely. Crossing Hungary, they encountered villages that refused to sell food, so they took it. Hungarian forces retaliated. Entire crusader companies vanished overnight, ambushed by farmers who saw them as locusts, not liberators. Then came the Byzantine Empire, technically Christian allies. In practice, Emperor Alexios viewed these Western barbarians with barely concealed horror. 100,000 armed fanatics marching through his territory? He rushed them toward Asia before they could sack Constantinople itself. By spring 1097, when the Crusader armies converged at Nicaea, their first real Muslim target, 40,000 had already died. Not from battle, from starvation, disease, ambush, and friendly fire. The survivors were hollow-eyed, hollow-bellied men who'd learned that God helps those who help themselves with extreme violence. Nicaea should have been impossible. Massive walls, 10,000 Turkish defenders. The Crusaders had 30,000 sick, exhausted besiegers and no siege equipment. But desperation breeds innovation. They built towers from scavenged wood, filled moats with Muslim corpses to create bridges, fought with the ferocity of men who knew retreat meant death. After 6 weeks, Nicaea surrendered. Not to Crusaders, to Byzantine forces who'd sneaked in by boat. The Crusaders got no plunder, just anger that would fester for decades. But they'd proven something. They could beat the unbeatable Seljuk Turks. Then came hell's true doorstep, Antioch, October 21st, 1097. The Pied Crusader army saw Antioch's walls and knew immediately this wasn't Nicaea. This was the fortress that had stood for 1,000 years. Walls 60 feet high, 400 towers, 100,000 residents. A Turkish garrison that laughed at the starving Westerners camped outside. The siege lasted 8 months. 8 months that broke men's bodies and souls. By December, Crusaders were eating their own horses. By February, they were eating leather from saddles. By April, chroniclers recorded something they could barely write. Cannibalism in Christian camps. Desperate men roasting Muslim corpses. Then Christian corpses. The smell of cooking human flesh mixing with prayers for deliverance. This is what faith looked like when food ran out. June 3rd, 1098, brought salvation through betrayal. A Turkish officer named Firuz, angry over unpaid wages, opened a tower gate at midnight. 4,000 Crusaders poured in before dawn. By sunrise, Antioch was theirs, its Muslim garrison slaughtered to the last man. But victory lasted 48 hours, because on June 5th, a Turkish relief army of 75,000 arrived. Suddenly the besiegers became the besieged. 15,000 starving Crusaders trapped inside Antioch by 75,000 fresh Muslim warriors outside. The mathematics were murder. Commanders calculated they had food for 10 days, strength for maybe one battle. After that, surrender or annihilation. Then something happened that defies rational explanation. On June 14th, a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed divine vision. He said the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath Antioch's church floor. They dug. They found something. A corroded spearhead that might have been 1,000 years old or might have been planted that morning. It didn't matter. Belief matters more than truth in desperate times. The Crusaders stopped seeing themselves as starving refugees and started seeing themselves as God's chosen army carrying Christ's own weapon. June 28th, 1098, 6 a.m., 12,000 men who could barely walk lined up for battle. Facing them, 75,000 Turkish cavalry on fresh horses. The Turks couldn't believe their eyes. These walking corpses were attacking. What happened next is documented by Christian and Muslim chroniclers alike, though neither can fully explain it. The Crusaders charged. Not in formation, they were too weak for discipline. Just a wave of screaming fanatics waving a rusty spear and believing absolutely that God fought beside them. The Turkish line buckled, then broke, then fled. By noon, 75,000 warriors were running from 12,000 dying men. Muslim commanders later said they saw saints fighting alongside the Crusaders, angels with flaming swords, visions that made their horses panic and their men flee. Or maybe they just saw what happens when men with nothing left to lose face men who'd already calculated retreat routes. By January 1099, the impossible survivors, now just 12,000, saw Jerusalem's walls for the first time. Most wept, some fell to their knees. After 1,000 days, 2,500 miles and 88,000 dead brothers, they'd reached the city that shouldn't have been reachable. One final siege stood between them and salvation. 40,000 Muslim defenders held Jerusalem. The Crusaders had no siege equipment and were dying of thirst. Jerusalem's wells had been poisoned. Then, impossibly, 6 Genoese ships appeared at Jaffa carrying timber for siege towers. Coincidence? Divine providence? It didn't matter. The Crusaders had their weapons. July 15th, 1099, 3 p.m. Godfrey de Bouillon's siege tower touched the wall. What happened next would echo for 1,000 years, but taking Jerusalem was the easy part. Holding it against endless waves of Islamic counterattacks, that would require something new, something the world had never seen. An order of warrior monks who made vows that sound insane even today. Imagine taking a vow that says, "I will never retreat, I will never surrender, I will fight until every brother beside me is dead, and then I will fight alone." Now imagine 20,000 men taking that vow. The Muslims called them devils in white cloaks. History calls them the Knights Templar. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Ordinary soldiers retreat when outnumbered. Ordinary soldiers negotiate ransoms when captured. Ordinary soldiers value their lives above victory. The Templars did none of these things. They were something unprecedented in human history. Professional holy warriors who treated death as promotion, not punishment. For 168 years they would be Jerusalem's unbreakable shield, and when that shield finally shattered, it would take the entire Muslim world to break it. 1119, 20 years after Jerusalem's conquest, the city faced a problem its Crusader conquerors hadn't anticipated. Pilgrims. Thousands of European Christians making the dangerous journey to walk where Christ walked. Most never made it. Muslim bandits controlled the roads. A pilgrim travelling from Jaffa to Jerusalem had a 40% chance of being robbed, enslaved, or killed. Enter Hugues de Payens, a French knight with a radical idea. He approached King Baldwin II with a proposal that sounded insane. Create a monastic order of warrior monks, men who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but instead of copying manuscripts, they'd kill anyone who threatened Christian pilgrims. 9 knights. That's how it started. 9 men living in the ruins of Solomon's temple, swearing oaths that made them sound like madmen. They would own nothing, touch no woman, obey without question, and most importantly, never retreat from Muslim forces even when outnumbered, even when death was certain, even when every tactical manual said withdrawal was the smart move. Here's the part that should have doomed them. Templars who survived battles by retreating were excommunicated, literally damned to hell, not court-martialed, not dishonoured, condemned to eternal torture for the sin of wanting to live. What kind of men sign up for that? Turns out thousands, because something happened that the 9 founders couldn't have predicted. In 1129, Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential monk in Europe, wrote a letter that changed everything. He called it In Praise of the New Knighthood. His argument was simple and revolutionary. Killing for Christ is not sin, but glory. A knight who dies fighting Muslims doesn't just go to heaven, he goes straight there, bypassing purgatory entirely. And the Muslim he kills? That's one less enemy of God. Suddenly, joining the Templars wasn't just military service. It was guaranteed salvation with extreme violence as the entry fee. Nobles flocked to take the white mantle with its red cross. Within 40 years, 9 knights became 20,000. Their wealth exceeded most European kingdoms, but here's what made them truly terrifying. They fought like machines. Modern historians studying Templar tactics use words like shock troops and special forces. Medieval Muslims use simpler language: devils, unstoppable, men who love death more than we love life. The Templar wedge formation became legendary. Picture 100 knights in triangular formation, lances lowered, charging at full gallop. The physics alone were devastating. 20 tons of armoured horseflesh and steel moving at 30 miles per hour. But physics wasn't the real weapon. Psychology was. Muslim cavalry knew that normal knights would break off after the initial impact. Templars didn't. They'd drive 200 yards into enemy lines, then wheel and charge again, and again, until they were dead or the enemy was fleeing. There was no third option. Saladin himself admitted he feared Templars more than any other Crusader force. "I would rather face 1,000 ordinary knights than 100 Templars," he wrote. "The knights fight for gold and glory, the Templars fight for paradise. You cannot negotiate with paradise." November 25th, 1177. We've already seen what happened at Montgisard, but let's focus on the 80 Templars who formed the tip of Baldwin's spear. They knew the mathematics. 26,000 enemies meant certain death. They charged anyway, because their rule said retreat was damnation, and damnation was worse than death. When the Muslim centre buckled, it wasn't superior numbers or tactics that broke them. It was terror. Terror of men who couldn't be reasoned with, bought off, or frightened. Men who'd rather die screaming than take one step backward. But the Templars weren't just warriors. They revolutionized medieval warfare in ways we still use today. They created the first standing professional army since Rome fell. Every brother trained daily, maintained peak fitness, and could execute complex battlefield maneuvers without verbal commands. Compare that to feudal knights who fought maybe once a year and treated war like a jousting tournament. They invented military banking. Templars had fortresses across Europe and the Middle East. A merchant could deposit gold in Paris, get a letter of credit and withdraw the equivalent in Jerusalem. Impossible. Before routine with Templars. This made them so wealthy that they financed entire crusades and loaned money to kings. And their fortresses? Architectural masterpieces that modern military engineers study. Crad des Chevaliers, the Hospitaller stronghold, held off 12 separate Muslim sieges. Its walls were 30 feet thick. Its design allowed 2,000 defenders to hold off 20,000 attackers indefinitely. It never fell to assault. Only starvation and trickery finally took it in 1271. The Hospitallers deserve mention here. Started as monks running a hospital for sick pilgrims, they evolved into warriors matching the Templars in ferocity. By 1150, they controlled 25 major fortresses and could field 5,000 knights. Their vows were identical: poverty, chastity, obedience, and never retreating from Muslims. Between the Templars and Hospitallers, Crusader states had a backbone of 10,000 professional soldiers who literally couldn't surrender. That's what kept Jerusalem Christian for 88 years despite being surrounded by Muslim empires. But every shield has a breaking point. And on July 4th, 1187, at a place called the Horns of Hattin, that breaking point arrived with catastrophic finality. King Guy of Jerusalem made the fatal mistake. He ignored Templar advice. The Templars said don't march inland in July without securing water sources. Guy marched anyway, convinced his 20,000 men could reach Tiberias before Saladin's 40,000 trapped them. They couldn't. By noon on July 4th, the Crusader army was dying of thirst, surrounded, facing Muslim forces that had spent the night camping near springs, while Christians licked rocks for moisture. 2 p.m. brought the massacre. Dehydrated men in full armour facing fresh cavalry, knights too weak to swing swords, horses collapsing from heat stroke. The Templars formed a final defensive position on the hilltop, 230 warrior monks back to back fighting with the mechanical precision that made them legendary. By 4 p.m., the Crusader army had ceased to exist. 15,000 dead or captured. Saladin offered to ransom prisoners. He'd made millions this way before, but when he reached the captured Templars, he made a different offer: convert to Islam or die. Every single Templar refused. All 230 chose beheading over betrayal. Saladin personally supervised the executions. Muslim chroniclers recorded that the Templars sang hymns as the swords fell, not prayers for mercy, victory hymns. Because to them, this wasn't defeat. This was martyrdom, the express route to paradise they'd been promised. Within 3 months, Jerusalem fell. The city that cost 100,000 lives to conquer was lost because one king's arrogance overruled Templar tactical genius. Saladin entered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on October 2nd, 1187. Christian Jerusalem was finished, but Jerusalem's loss ignited something unexpected in Europe. Kings who'd ignored Crusader pleas suddenly cared, because losing the Holy Land meant losing face, losing prestige, losing God's favour. The Third Crusade was coming, and leading it, the most legendary warrior king in European history, a man who'd never lost a battle, a giant who could bend horseshoes with bare hands, a king so obsessed with Jerusalem that he'd literally sell his kingdom to retake it. Richard the Lionheart was coming, and when he faced Saladin, the world would witness the deadliest duel in medieval history. Two men, one Christian, one Muslim, both called legends in their own lifetimes. Richard the Lionheart, 6 feet 5 inches, could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, had never lost a battle. Saladin united Islam's fractured empires, conquered Jerusalem, feared by every Christian king. For 3 years they would dance the deadliest waltz in medieval history, and somehow neither would win. This wasn't just warfare, this was personal. Two military geniuses testing each other across hundreds of miles and dozens of battles. Muslim chroniclers called it the contest of titans. Modern historians call it the most fascinating military rivalry of the Middle Ages. Here's what makes it tragic. They never met face to face, not once. These men who respected each other more than their own allies fought a 3-year war without ever standing in the same room. July 4th, 1190. Richard Plantagenet, King of England, stood on Dover's docks watching his invasion fleet assemble. 17,000 professional soldiers, 100 ships, the largest Crusader army ever fielded. It had cost him everything, literally. "I would sell London itself to retake Jerusalem," he told advisers. They thought he was being dramatic. He wasn't. Richard had actually sold everything. Government positions, castles, titles. He'd even released Scotland's king from prison for 10,000 marks ransom. England was bankrupted. Richard didn't care. Jerusalem was the only prize that mattered, but first came Cyprus. When his fleet shipwrecked there and the local Byzantine ruler imprisoned survivors, Richard's response was predictable and excessive. Conquer the entire island. It took 3 weeks. Muslim scouts sent urgent messages to Saladin. This king is different. This one fears nothing. April 20th, 1191. Richard arrived at Acre, a Crusader city under siege for 2 years. Both sides were exhausted, starving, making no progress. Richard took one look and said, 3 weeks. His commanders thought he was insane. The siege had already consumed 2 years and 100,000 lives. Richard finished it in 35 days. How? By getting violently sick and still directing siege warfare from his sickbed. Muslim defenders watched in disbelief as servants carried the English king on a litter to the walls so he could personally aim trebuchets. If their enemy king fought while dying of fever, what hope did healthy defenders have? July 12th, 1191. Acre surrendered. Richard's first act shocked everyone. He ordered 2,700 Muslim prisoners executed when Saladin delayed ransom payment by 3 days. The massacre took 4 hours. Saladin received the news and understood. Immediately. This wasn't another Crusader king playing at war. This was a predator. August 22nd, 1191. Richard's army began marching south toward Jerusalem, 90 miles through hostile territory, with Saladin's entire force shadowing them. Richard's innovation was brutal and brilliant. Infantry outside, cavalry protected inside, pace so slow that formations never broke. For 7 days, Muslim cavalry harassed them constantly. Richard's orders were absolute. Hold formation, do not charge, wait for my signal. Templars and Hospitallers took arrows in silence. Knights watched brothers die without retaliating. The psychological pressure was unbearable. September 7th, 1191, 11 a.m., the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin threw 40,000 cavalry against Richard's 20,000 marching Crusaders, wave after wave. For 3 hours, Richard held his line while arrows darkened the sky, and knights collapsed from heat stroke. Then, at 1 p.m., disaster. A wounded Hospitaller knight, unable to endure more, charged. 1. Knight became 10, became hundreds. The formation broke. Any other commander would have panicked. Richard saw opportunity. In 3 seconds, he made the decision that defines genius. Signal the charge! All cavalry, now! 2,000 knights who'd been holding discipline for 3 hours suddenly unleashed. The pent-up fury hit Muslim lines like an avalanche. The impact was heard 5 miles away. Saladin's formations disintegrated. By 3 p.m., his army was fleeing. 7,000 Muslim dead. Richard's losses, 700. The worst defeat of Saladin's career. But winning battles didn't mean winning the war, and both men knew it. October 1191. Richard reached within 12 miles of Jerusalem. On clear days, scouts could see the city walls. His army begged to assault. Richard said no. He retreated. June 1192. Richard marched on Jerusalem again, got within 12 miles again, retreated again. His soldiers wept, some deserted, others accused him of cowardice. One chronicler recorded Richard covering his eyes, saying, "Lord, let me not see your holy city, since I cannot deliver it." Why? Because Richard had done the mathematics. Jerusalem sat 50 miles inland. Even if he conquered it, holding it was impossible. His army would eventually sail home. Saladin's wouldn't. Conquering Jerusalem would be strategically meaningless. It was the most mature decision of his career, also the most heartbreaking. Saladin watched Richard's second retreat and understood. They'd fought to a draw. He couldn't defeat Richard in battle. Richard couldn't hold Jerusalem, neither could win. Both could keep fighting until their armies died. So they did something unprecedented. They negotiated, not face to face, but through messengers who travelled between camps almost daily. Two legends making peace without meeting. The Treaty of Jaffa, September 2nd, 1192. Jerusalem would remain Muslim-controlled, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely, unarmed and safe. Neither side got what they wanted, both got what they needed, stable. Peace. But here's where mutual respect became legendary. When Richard fell sick during negotiations, Saladin sent his personal physician with ice and fruit from Damascus. When Saladin's brother needed medical care, Richard sent his best doctor. They fought savagely for 3 years, then exchanged gifts like old friends. Muslim chroniclers recorded Saladin saying, "I fear to lose such a knight as Richard. He is a worthy adversary." Christian poets wrote that Richard wept when learning Saladin praised his courage. Two warriors who never met became friends through mutual slaughter. September 9th, 1192. Richard sailed from Acre forever. He'd won every battle, lost the war, bankrupted England, failed to recapture Jerusalem, yet his legend only grew. Because everyone understood. He'd fought Saladin to a draw, and nobody else had ever done that. March 4th, 1193. Saladin died in Damascus, exhausted from decades of warfare. Richard died 6 years later from a crossbow wound during a minor siege, killed by a boy with a frying pan as shield, the universe's cruel joke on a legendary warrior. Neither achieved their ultimate goal. Both achieved immortality. They proved that sometimes the greatest victories aren't conquests, but recognizing when conquest is impossible. But their failure wasn't the end of crusading. It was just the beginning of something far darker. Because when faith stops being about salvation and starts being about conquest, when popes start selling heaven like real estate, when children are sent to die for sins they haven't committed, that's when crusading becomes something else entirely, something that would stain Christianity for centuries. The Fourth Crusade was coming, and it wouldn't even reach Muslim territory before committing atrocities that would make Saladin look merciful. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. It didn't even reach Muslim territory. Instead, Christian crusaders conquered Christian Constantinople, raped nuns in cathedrals, and sold Byzantium's sacred relics to pay Venetian debts. The Children's Crusade sent 30,000 kids to Egyptian slave markets. The Albigensian Crusade murdered 20,000 French Catholics for believing slightly different theology. Somewhere along the way, the sacred defenders became the monsters they swore to fight. The Fourth Crusade began with noble intentions. Pope Innocent III called for Jerusalem's reconquest. 35,000 crusaders answered. They needed ships. Venice had ships. But Venetian merchants didn't care about salvation. They cared about profit. 85,000 silver marks for transport, the Doge said. The Crusaders had 51,000. The Venetians smiled. Then you'll work off your debt. First, conquer Zara for us. Zara was a Christian city, papal property. The Crusaders hesitated for maybe an hour, then shrugged and attacked fellow Christians to pay their shipping bill. Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire crusade, then forgave them when they promised to get back on track. They didn't. April 12th, 12:04, 6 a.m. Constantinople, the greatest Christian city on earth, opened its gates expecting Crusader allies marching to fight Muslims. Instead, 20,000 Latin Crusaders poured in like locusts. What happened next makes Muslim conquest look merciful by comparison. For 3 days, Crusaders raped, murdered and looted the richest city in Christendom. Nuns were assaulted in convents, priests were murdered at altars, the Library of Constantinople, containing texts from ancient Greece and Rome that existed nowhere else, was burned for warmth. Crusaders melted down priceless Byzantine art for bullion. They dressed prostitutes in empresses' crowns and paraded them through Hagia Sophia. One eyewitness, the historian Nicetas Choniates, recorded crusaders wearing Christ's crown of thorns as party hats, using chalices as drinking cups, feeding Eucharist wafers to their horses. The psychological destruction was total. Eastern Christians watched Western Christians desecrate everything they held sacred. The split between Eastern and Western Christianity became permanent that day. This wound never healed. When Constantinople finally fell to actual Muslims in 1453, many Greeks said they preferred Turkish turbans to Latin mitres. The Fourth Crusade accomplished what 400 years of Islamic pressure couldn't. It destroyed Byzantium from within. But at least those were adults making evil choices. What came next was evil done to innocents. A French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed Jesus appeared to him with a message. Children's innocence would succeed where adult sin had failed. March to Jerusalem, Jesus supposedly said. The Mediterranean will part like the Red Sea. 30,000 children believed him, ages 8 to 16 mostly. Peasant kids who'd never travelled beyond their villages, convinced that faith alone would transport them to the Holy Land. Their parents watched them march south, singing hymns, promising to be home by autumn with Jerusalem, liberated. The sea didn't part. Instead, merchants at Marseille offered free transport. 2 ships sailed. Both went to Alexandria, not Jerusalem. The merchants had prearranged deals with Egyptian slave traders. 30,000 Christian children sold into slavery for profit margins that made Venetian ship captains look honest. Not one child reached Jerusalem. Not one returned home. The few who survived slavery died never knowing they'd been betrayed by Christians, not Muslims. Pope Innocent III, hearing the news, reportedly wept. "These children shame us," he said. "They sought to do what we cannot." Then he launched another crusade. Against Christians, in France. The Albigensian Crusade makes the Fourth Crusade look like a mistake instead of a pattern. Southern France had developed a Christian sect called Cathars, believers who thought the physical world was evil and spiritual purity required rejecting material wealth. The Catholic Church called this heresy, the solution, genocide, July 22, 1209. Crusaders arrived at Béziers, a city of 20,000. Most were Catholic, some were Cathar. When soldiers asked how to tell them apart, Papal legate Arnaud Amalric gave history's most chilling order: "Kill them all, God will know his own." They did. 20,000 dead in one afternoon. Catholic churches became slaughterhouses. Priests were murdered beside Cathars. Women and children burned alive in cathedrals. The Crusaders then went church to church across southern France for 20 years, systematically exterminating anyone who questioned Catholic doctrine. This wasn't fighting Muslims. This was Christians killing Christians for thinking differently about Christianity. The Crusades had become a weapon pointed at anyone Rome disliked. Meanwhile, actual Muslim forces were systematically recapturing Crusader territories nobody defended anymore. Antioch fell in 1268, Tripoli in 1289. Each time, European kingdoms shrugged. Crusading had lost its appeal when popes used crusade armies to settle. Personal scores. The 5th through 8th Crusades were exercises in diminishing returns. Frederick II briefly recaptured Jerusalem through diplomacy in 1229. No bloodshed, just negotiation, and was excommunicated for not killing enough Muslims. Jerusalem was lost again in 1244. Nobody came to help. Louis IX of France tried twice. Holy, sincere, genuinely believed God wanted him in the Holy Land. He died of dysentery in Tunisia in 1270, still believing. He was the last true believer among Crusader kings. By 1291, only one Crusader city remained: Acre, May 18th, 1291, dawn. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived with 60,000 warriors and a simple message: leave or die. Inside Acre's walls, 15,000 Christians knew this was the end. No rescue was coming. Europe had stopped caring. The siege lasted 43 days. Every day, Mamluk trebuchets hurled stones that shook the earth. Every night, defenders repaired walls, knowing tomorrow would bring fresh destruction. By mid-May, Sections of wall looked like cheese, holes everywhere, held together by prayer and desperation. The Templars made their last stand at the final tower. 500 warrior monks, back to back, fighting with the mechanical precision that had made them legendary for 172 years. They sang hymns between sword strokes. They called to brothers to remember their vows. Never retreat, never surrender. May 28th, 1291, 9 a.m. The tower, undermined by Mamluk sappers, collapsed. The structure came down on attackers and defenders together, burying 500 Templars and 2,000 Muslims under tons of stone. The last Templar died holding a cross, buried in rubble that wouldn't be cleared for 600 years. Acre's fall marked the end. 200 years, 9 major crusades, millions dead. For what? The legacy isn't clean. It's written in blood and gold, courage and corruption, miracles and massacres. The Crusaders proved that faith can make men invincible. They also proved that invincibility doesn't mean righteousness. The same faith that made knights stand against impossible odds also made them butcher innocents in God's name. Military historians study Templar tactics. Architects study Crusader castles. But the real lesson is darker. Belief without wisdom is dangerous. Faith without mercy is monstrous. When you convince men they're doing God's work, there's no atrocity they won't commit with clear conscience. Jerusalem changed hands 6 times in 200 years. It stayed Muslim. The Byzantine Empire, Christianity's greatest bulwark, destroyed by Christian crusaders. The Templars burned as heretics by a French king who owed them money. The Crusaders were neither pure heroes nor simple villains. They were men who believed so completely they marched 2,500 miles to die for a city most had never seen. That faith made them extraordinary. That same faith made them terrible. And that's the truth history won't let us forget.